and Owen Duffy is a filmmaker. He just made this film, I Am Here, with the NFB, and I believe it was nominated for an Oscar? Maybe long-listed for an Oscar? I'm not sure which one it was. Anyway, he'll be speaking, and the next person that will be speaking is Nancy Lee, and Nancy Lee is a really amazing filmmaker, cinematographer, and makes these really interesting interactive installations, one in which is a thing called Pendula. It's a swing. The swing is connected to Arduino controllers, and that controls real-time graphics and all this kind of stuff. So she's really, really next level. So the original talk was called Towards Real Time, and I kind of made this point, it was to a bunch of visual effects people, that real time is going to take over the animation industry in a big way. And when I said it 3 months ago, it felt kind of mundane. It felt like it was obvious. And now 3 months later, it's even more obvious. It's like, we already know that Lucasfilms in 2012 introduced this real-time engine that they're developing, so they can composite and capture people's performance in real time. Unreal Engine in 2016 at SIGGRAPH released the fact that you can capture real-time data directly into Unreal, do live performances. They actually did one during their presentation. Filmmakers like Neil Blomkamp from Oats Studio. He's the guy who made District 9. He's making real-time movies or videos using Unity. And this is a random person on YouTube using iPhone X to do facial capture along with body capture. This is actually not real-time though. This is just, but the technology is just becoming it's so out there everywhere that it's kind of inevitable, I find. And so I guess I'm just going to talk about how it applies to my own practice, my own filmmaking, and give you a little journey of the steps I've gone through. I'll talk about my first real step towards real time, which was this film Change that I made for a musician named Michael Red, and it was kind of fake real time. It was Maya viewport rendering, but it still required some amount of rendering. It still required screen capture, and then I'll show a film that I made entirely real time. So really quickly about me, is there a way to make this full screen? Oh, look at that. That's very cool. So I work at Emily Carr University, actually, which is just over there. I'm a technician, and as a technician, that means I basically help students with their projects, and I help them come up with creative solutions for all the various things that they run into on a day-to-day basis. I also manage all the computers and push out updates to 120 computers. So you guys all heard about Meltdown and Spectre? Like, we spent a week there just pushing out Windows updates. You'd think it'd be really easy to push out a Windows update. It's not. You actually, whatever, I won't go to that. Oh, well, I ran into it. Never mind, I guess I won't do that. There's 3 parts of my day. The first part is working at Emily Carr. The second part is working at a studio space called Z Space downtown that I run with Dean. Where it's kind of like an underground vibe, visual effects and motion studio space. We actually have 2 desks available right now, so if anyone's looking for studio space, we hold events, we have projectors and all that kind of stuff. And in that space, I mostly do freelance work, and my biggest client is an artist named Stan Douglas. Has anyone heard of Stan Douglas? Have you raised your hand? Darren? He's a contemporary photographer, and what he likes to do is reconstruct historical events in excruciating detail, and then print them on large pieces of metal and sell them as art. So I assist him in the process, and these are super high resolution renders. So they're actually they're 36K wide. They're 10 feet wide by 300 dpi. So what we do is we actually split them up into 4K panels, and then render out 45 of them, and then stitch them all together. And the files are like 250 gigs or something, and they're all 32-bit EXRs. And yeah, the effect is actually quite amazing when you see these on the wall, because you see them really large, and then you walk up to them, and they have an amazing, listen to me, an amazing amount of detail. They have a lot of detail. And so all this is modeled and textured from hand, or by hand. And looking back at it now, I think it could be a bit more convincing, but there's still, I mean, we're kind of imagining ourselves as the people we're putting the chairs just so, and thinking that they might have to chop wood because they have, wood burning stove. It's this kind of, these massive kind of intellectual kind of thought experiments that go into these prints. The last one I did was of London in This is the riot in 2011. So in this case, we actually went and we took, Stan Douglas went and shot this giant plate from a helicopter in London, and then we went through footage of the riots and we cut out individuals, 900 of them to be exact, and then we took them and placed them into the photo, and then we wanted all the shadows to be right, so we then took 3D models of people and placed them to match all the people as well, rendered ambient occlusion passes and everything. And we also simulated trash blowing down the street, newspapers, etc. So the one thing that's common about all these projects is they drive me absolutely mad. I'm just like, in the middle of them, I hate life. It's like and I said this last time, but like, there's always this moment at 3 in the morning where all my hard drives are full and I'm trying to render something and I'm just tearing my hair out. I just remembered a quote by you. I'll get to it later. Anyway, so there's the third part of my day, which is my experimental practice. That's like after Emily Carr and after I work on my freelance stuff, I work on experimental stuff. And it's my happy place, absolutely. And most of the time it's me trying to make things that don't have that aren't operating under the same constraints that the other projects are. So I don't have a client that I have to please, I don't have a budget, I don't have time constraints. And I'm usually trying to solve things that some of the problems that I run into on my day-to-day basis. And so I guess that what I want to kind of impress, or what I want to communicate with this is that I'm kind of two things. I'm a technician and I'm someone who tries to use technology in a way that's, I don't want to be like say art, but in a way that's unusual and that's expressive, and it's part of two worlds. And that's something that I don't think I'm unique in that way, but it's something that I think there's real value to. And actually, this artist, I don't know if you guys know Alan Warburton. Did anyone see that video that went around the internet recently called "The End of the Uncanny Valley"? Talking about, it's really interesting. This is part of one of his little talk. It's 25 minutes long, but you should definitely watch it. But basically, in this video, he talks about how people are understanding that CGI technology is really useful to their art practices, but there's usually a kind of a hierarchy. It's like, you have like a director, and the director is talking to the supervisor, and the supervisor is talking to the modeler, or there's a chain of command, and through which that kind of telephone call, that game of telephone, information is lost. And so he talks about how interesting it is when there are people who use technology and know the technology and also make things with the technology. And I think that's where I am. I don't think I'm definitely not on that level, but. So let's get back to this idea of like me being frustrated with EXRs and files and stuff, because I think that's where it kind of came from. This came to a real point in 2014 when I was invited to VJ for a New Forms Festival, which is an electronic festival that takes place here in Vancouver. And it was my first time VJing ever, and they gave me Saturday night. It was the main stage. It was 6 hours of VJing, and I was like, no one person can make 6 hours of interesting animation in any amount of time. I think it would actually take 15 years or something. So, and I think about it, and I've been to clubs before that have VJs there, and it's like sometimes it's a cube that's rotating, and it's like it's scaling, and then you see the loop, and at that point your buzz is gone, and you're like, I need to get the fuck out of here. Anyway, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to make things that were really interesting and that people could watch for a long time. So I started trying to figure out different ways that I could kind of get around all these constraints, how I could make 6 hours worth of footage that would be really interesting. So what I started doing is I started making simulations in Maya and then just letting them run all night and screen capping them as they run. And so I'd set up a render or set up a simulation, and then I'd wake up and I'd have 10,000 frames, and maybe something interesting would happen for 4,000 of those frames. But I did this over and over and over in different ways, and I ended up with like 200 gigabytes of MOV sequences, and then my intention was to switch through those and kind of combine them along with the music. So I've learned about a program called Resolume Avenue. Anyone here know Resolume Avenue? Raise your hand. Of course you do. Of course you do. Of course you do. Yeah, okay. Resolume Avenue is like After Effects, but it's in real time. So it's like you have all the same controls. You can adjust the speed of different layers. You can adjust the opacity of different layers. You can apply effects. You can do brightness, contrast. So the first thing I did was like, of course, brightness. Like when the beat hits, you turn up the brightness. It's really boring, but and it's all mapped to a MIDI controller, like such. So yeah, and so I thought it was really interesting because you take these two videos and you overlay them on top of each other. You have one that's add underneath and one that's multiply on top, and then you add a bit of motion blur, and out of those two things, you actually end up with a new image. It's kind of a combination of two, but so you end up making things that kind of only occur once because that are, and that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to create stuff that you see it and you didn't feel like you were seeing one part of a clip, but you felt like something new was happening in front of you. This is what the interface looks like. You can see the different layers and more examples of just what that looks like when you combine different clips. I look at this now and I'm like, oh, that's so novice, but I don't know. I still find it pretty appealing. The quote that I remembered from Tim was, I think it was about a year ago. I should get this tattooed on my body somewhere. He said, pre-rendered footage is so 2016, I think. Is that it?
Something like that.
And he said that and it hurt me. And it hurt me badly, and I knew I had to change something. I had to change my ways. Okay, so so I did that for about a year, and I did all this kind of pre-rendered stuff and mixing it stuff for a year, and started doing VJing underground. I keep saying underground. Underground clubs and stuff, and it's not a way to make a living, by the way, at all. It's like maybe you get $200 or $300, and you show up to a club having prepared for 10 hours, and then you mix, and no one cares about you, and you get a drink spilled on your computer, and then you leave. I'm kind of painting a dark picture of it. There are definitely satisfying moments within that, but anyway, I did that a little bit, and it's definitely a lot of work. But there was actually another opportunity kind of came up. I was approached by a label called Babel Pressed, and they wanted me to make a video for a piece of music by Michael Redd called Change. And let me see if I have it next. Okay, oops, well, I've just completely derailed myself. But when I first heard this piece of music, I was it threw me for a loop because it's unlike any piece of music I've ever heard in my life, and I think you'll hear that in a second. Usually music kind of follows a predictable arc, and it follows a bit like Freytang's triangle. Do you guys know what Freytang's triangle is? It's this. It's like the basis of all narrative. You have the rising action, and then you have the climax, and then there's the falling action, and music usually follows that pretty well. And so making a music video for that's pretty good. But this piece of music was like 7.5 sprawling minutes of very difficult to discern narrative, and I found it really challenging, and I found it really intriguing, and so I decided to spend the next 2 years of my life making a music video for it. But it ended up being kind of a repository, a place where I put all the ideas that I was thinking about at that particular moment. And the music was so unusual and so different from anything I'd ever heard before that I didn't even know how to plan it out. I didn't even know how I could storyboard this. So what I did is I made it kind of like a process-based piece. So I started out with a camera, and this is actually built more around this, but I kind of built a spaceship and named it Explorer. And then I was like, all right, I'm going to explore this music. I'm just going to start the camera, and then I'm going to fly it off into the void of space, and then I'll see what comes out of it. And that was my kind of approach. So I think this next slide should be the video. I'm not going to show all 7.5 minutes because I don't think we have time. I'm going to talk over part of it, which I think is probably bad, like some people say would be a bad thing, but that's okay. So this is just the first part of it. Can you see it? Do you guys want to keep watching, or should I just... That's kind of my question. Okay, let's watch the whole thing All right, that was it.
Ooh, sweet.
So I think the most common question, I kind of like the two screens, by the way. That was fun. I haven't had a screening set up like that before. So I think the most common question people ask me about that is, why did you make that? My approach to things is, actually, I don't actually know. In the moment, I wasn't planning on making anything. As I've told you, I had a camera and I was pointing it into emptiness, and I was trying to explore this piece of music. I was trying to be a conduit for the music, and I hope that kind of came through, that I was responding kind of directly to the music, which was extremely strange. But I also kind of think of it as a representation of where I was mentally and where I was conceptually, the things I was thinking about when I made that piece. So that was 2015. If I was to be really honest, I was thinking a lot about death. I was thinking a lot about my place in the universe, and I think that's not just me. That's everyone. I think it's what humans think about a lot. And we make up narratives to kind of frame us in something larger. Maybe it means that we think that we believe in God, or we believe in something. And for me, when I was growing up, I always had this. I had this one myth that I held really close. So not myth, but this idea about this origin story about the Big Bang. And it was that everything started out at a single point, and everything exploded, at a point of infinite density, and exploded, and then eventually, after billions and billions and billions of years, or hundreds of billions, I don't know, gravity would eventually bring us all back together into something that was called the Big Crunch, and that we'd be back. That's actually a real concept. It's a real thing, and that we'd be back at this center point again, and then potentially again, given infinite time, it might happen again, and given an infinite time, it might happen an infinite number of times. And to me, that was kind of a way. It was a way of believing both in science and recursion, and at the same time. And then I read another book. I think it was A Brief History of Time, but apparently in the 90s they discovered that actually matter's not all going to crunch back together and become a single point again. That actually every galaxy is accelerating away from each other. The existence of, and I could be wrong, if anyone knows this better than I am, I'm not an astrophysicist or whatever. If anyone knows, well, essentially dark matter is exerting energy, exerting some sort of force on everything. And instead of there being a big crunch where we all get brought back together, all matter will be distributed throughout the universe until it is basically a density of zero. Everything's just gonna go farther and farther away from each other. And I thought that was really sad. Listen, it is sad. And when I first heard that, it was like my dreams were crushed or whatever. And I thought all the meaning that we have, everything that we've created so far, would just be farther and farther apart. And then, no, let's not watch that again, please. And then, let me just turn off the sound. Do you know how to turn off the sound? I can't do it on the computer.
It's on this guy in the back. There's a mute button. Yeah.
You see it? Okay. So let's see. Oh yeah, and thinking about the universe like that, the Big Bang and the Big Crunch, it requires you to think about time on a different scale. So that was the first thing I wanted to work with this piece of music, which I wanted to think about space and time on massively different scales. So I wanted to think about traveling across the universe and going from a very large place to a very small place. I also wanted to think about different scales of time. Things happen in an instant here and now, but there are billions and billions of years between real celestial events. So I was thinking about that quite a bit. I was also thinking about the nature of reality being kind of change as being the constant. So usually in CGI we're representing things with vertices and textures and everything is very static. But I wanted to find a different way of making images that would kind of express the infinitely changing nature of reality if we could see it for actually what it was. And so that kind of informed my aesthetic choice. But to go back to this idea of the big cool, and meaning being lost and everything. This one crazy idea I found online kind of saved me from my existential vertigo that I had at that point, and that was the theory of panspermia. Does anyone know the panspermia theory? It's really kind of silly, and a lot of people don't believe it. I don't even know if I believe it, but the idea is that instead of a life originating from a lightning bolt hitting the primordial soup and life spontaneously coming about, the idea is that life might have actually come from somewhere else in the universe. And it actually kind of makes sense if you think about it. It's like, oh, did something bubble and then all of a sudden life appear, or did something travel from a different part of space? And I thought that was really interesting. And I still don't know if I believe it, but what I thought was really interesting about that was it changes the way that you look out into space. When you look at stars and you believe in panspermia, it's like we're not this like freak accident on a rock that's floating through space. Instead, we're like part of some much larger narrative. We're just one branch in a kind of evolutionary tree that might span all sorts of space and time. And maybe that sounds crazy. But the really interesting thing to me about that was that, and this is why I chose this image to represent change, is that I felt that if there was life here and there was life on different planets and different universes, it actually might kind of structurally and formally resemble that's on Earth. Because if you look at a shell is actually just a trace of a process. It's just something that's excreting something, and over time it accumulates. And the laws of physics would be the same in different parts of the universe as well. And so you might travel across all of space and all of time and get to a different galaxy across and find a little planet that has life on it. And on that shore you might find a shell that looks like similar, but essentially the same as a shell here on Earth. So that's the idea for the film, and that's the reason I made it. And I think that's what I was trying to get out when I first undertook that project. Does that make sense? Does that kind of? Okay, I've never actually explained that before, so it's. I feel like a crazy person. That's okay. I am a crazy person. Anyway, so now I'm going to talk about the actual process and get away from the ideas and everything. So I knew I had a bunch of goals before I made this film. I wanted to make something where I could react to something in real time, where I could make changes and not have to wait for the render to come out and not have to wait for 5 hours for all the final gathering and everything like that. I know I wanted to make something 4K finally because that felt futuristic, and also because when you have a 4K image, you actually relate to things on a different scale. It's like when you view this image on a 4K screen, your eyes get lost in the crevices and all the details that are all around everywhere. If you watch it on your phone, it still works to a bit, but it works a little bit. But then there's H.264 compression all over it and everything. So yeah, and I also wanted to, as I said before, make something that felt spontaneous, that reflected the change being the constant of the universe, and also I just wanted to use CGI like paint, and I think that's something that's unique to this point in time. We couldn't do that 15 years ago. You couldn't go into ZBrush and just blob on a whole bunch of polygons because computers weren't fast enough. But now, and you kind of see this in CGI aesthetic, I think now, you see people who are using CGI in ways that we couldn't before. They're just duplicating thousands of things, and they're getting interesting effects. And so I wanted to do something like that as well. Let's see, I forgot what I was going to say about this, but essentially the materials are all real-time materials. They are really mostly made up of overlapping noise patterns with normal maps and reflections. A lot of real-time reflections using environment spheres. I look at this and I made it in such an intuitive kind of headspace. I don't even remember how I made that shader. But I knew that I wanted to, again, make something that was always changing and always evolving, and something that I could create and I could leave it, and then I could just kind of move my camera through and discover little pockets of interesting things. So this is kind of one of the natural life forms. This is a normal map that's being translated across on the x-axis, and it's being translated across really messed up UVs. And that was my way of painting, was taking the UV maps and really stretching them. Does everyone know what UV maps are? Do you guys do 3D stuff? It's it's essentially mapping a 2D image onto a 3D object. It's like taking an orange and flattening it out, putting an image on it, and then wrapping it back up. So yeah, I thought that the effects were really interesting. And the other thing about this is, like, you're not really seeing the form. You're seeing this like accumulation of reflections and stuff. So there's this thing called Gestalt theory, which is where your mind is constantly making up what you're seeing. You're getting imperfect information about the stuff around you all the time, and your brain has to fill in the rest of it. So I really like to play with that, essentially. So here's one of the shaders, and I won't go through the whole thing explaining it, but this is like one of many. Actually, a lot of the animation in the film happened on the shader level. It was animating, as I said before, UVs or brightness levels. The one really important thing here is this one, which is the sampler info node, if anyone uses Maya. But basically, it gives you information about how distant, or about the camera, essentially. So how distant the camera is, or how each face, how much it's facing the camera or not. And so you can take all these things and you can plug them into shaders. And I use that to make things that would always change no matter what angle you were at. So I wanted things to kind of come alive as the camera approached them. And so I would have all these kind of material attributes that linked to the camera distance, essentially. And then here's a little peek of the modeling. I wanted to make natural forms that were kind of fractal and iterative. I think that someone else could probably code this, but I don't know if I made this clear. I'm not really a coder. I do a little bit of coding, but a lot of it's just iterative modeling. So it's doing the same process over and over. And then you get kind of interesting forms like that. Yeah, and so there's a lot of, all these forms were modeled by myself, but there are also some forms that were downloaded offline or online from Creative Commons. So there's a lot of objects in the film that were, for example, like a molecular structure, a cell scan. And then I'd take these objects and I'd fragment them using Voronoi fracturing, or just kind of slicing them by hand. And I'd take those and I'd scatter them. And I really like that because it gives like, as what happens with me is I look at this and I see a form that I kind of recognize, and my brain goes, oh, I understand what that is, but then it's fragmented and I start to question myself. And so I like this kind of these hints of things that make sense, and then they kind of go away. And then finally, these are the most alive things in the film, and these are made using particle emission. So it's basically particles being emitted, and those particles are emitting particles that are staying still. And so they kind of mimic the way that they mimic natural processes a little bit, but they were animated using turbulence. And the last thing I wanted to mention is just the camera movement, which I hope that it felt like the camera was a bit of a character, like it was finding things, it was seeing things, it was looking at them. I really like to kind of try to break cinematic convention. I'm not really into like wide shot, medium shot, close-up shot, whatever. I wanted the camera to kind of act on its own and with a language that was unfamiliar to the viewer. By the way, how am I doing for time?
Fine.
Fine? Okay. Whew. I got a lot more stuff to talk about. Yeah, I don't remember what I was going to say for this either, but that's okay. Yeah. Okay, so I'm done with change for now. Now this is like stepping into actual real time. So I was thinking of ways that I could just get rid of the whole EXR sequences and MOVs and all that stuff. I wanted to step into actual real time. So my first thing was using Unreal. This was me kind of imagining how I could use Unreal Engine for a VJ set. So I've got particle emission triggered by keyboard strokes, and I could emit particles and then move the camera around and everything. And I like this, but when I look at this, it looks like Unreal Engine to me. And I think it's probably has to do with the real-time reflections. It's a very Unreal aesthetic. And I wanted something that didn't really look like Unreal. Also, Unreal is kind of made to make video games, and I wanted something that gave me a little bit more freedom. So I ended up using Touch Designer, choosing Touch Designer. Can I get a show of hands how many people have heard of or know Touch Designer? Okay. Oh, that's really cool. Lots of people. What was that?
We only know about it.
You only know about it, you haven't used it? I don't think that's true. Yeah. So just really quickly, I won't go into the reason. Well, really quickly, it's a node-based visual programming language. And me, I don't code. I don't know Python. Well, I have done a little bit, but I definitely don't think in text. So to me, this was like, oh my God! All of a sudden, I have access to all these tools that only coders have been using for years, and now I can use them as an artist. I can just drag and click and combine things. So this is me just mapping the two attributes of the sphere onto a MIDI controller so I can control them. And I found that if I had overlapping motion and multiple things animating at the same time, that you could kind of come up with some interesting effects. Another reason I chose Touch Designer was because there's tons of inputs that are native to it. So this is just a live recording. I'm bringing in a video feed. I'm bringing in my desktop feed. I'm bringing in all my MIDI controllers, my microphone, my mouse coordinates, a joystick. I've tried loading this thing up with like 20 different input items, and it always works. And it's always in this like really, it's just giving you a number, and you can do anything with that number. So I thought that was really cool. So here's an example of how you can also organize the nodes visually so that they make more sense to you. So instead of it being like code where I don't know where I've left off and everything, it's like I can kind of look at this and get an idea of what everything's doing. These are my MIDI controllers. So this is what do you remember the picture of the MIDI controller that I had earlier that had the orange tape? This is it right here. And I even gave it colors to kind of match the tape that was on the MIDI controller so I could always go back and find it. One more thing I liked about Touch Designer is that you can use OSC signal, and so there's a program called Touch OSC that lets you make interfaces on your iPad or phone, and then you can send that over Wi-Fi, and then it just ends up being another number that you can read in Touch Designer. So I was going to show that, but I think I'll skip that. So here's my first experiment making a VR this is my first VR experiment with Touch Designer. So this is all made with nodes. Basically what I did is I reproduced my desktop in 3D. So you can see my desktop is there. Then I had it on my joystick. I had a little way of moving the screen away from me because it was actually quite large. So I move it away, and then I have a live feed of myself. Dork. And then I press a button, and it toggles a polygon that's parented to my head that is using the camera feed from the HTC Vive. And so this is really useful because you're always running into shit. We've written 2 keyboards. And that was just a little interaction thing. This is an installation that Dean had an idea for. It's essentially just a bunch of geometry that's instanced over a whole bunch of points, and they're all orienting towards the Vive controller. And yeah, I don't know it's really just an experiment. I don't actually know how that would be useful. I can't imagine there being a VR installation. There's all the infrastructure requiring people to come in. You only get 5 minutes, clean off the lens, all this kind of stuff. But it's still fun. So yeah, that was like kind of just seeing what the possibilities were there. And then here's an example of how I took that VJ set that I spoke about earlier, which was all these different clips that I would mix. This is what I did to replace it so that everything was being generated in real time. And so a lot of it's just it's geometry. It's generated platforms that have rolling textures. I've got a button that randomizes the rotation of the camera with a bit of easing motion so that I could, on the beat, rotate the camera, which actually sounds like what I described earlier as not liking. But yeah, so I basically have all these things, and this is all being passed over wirelessly. So sometimes when I'm in a club setting and I'm VJing, I'm like actually on the dance floor, and I'm like kind of wandering around my iPad. And I feel cool for like a fraction of a second, and then I'm like, oh no. And actually, usually people come up and they're like, what's going on? And then I show them, and then they walk away. Anyway. Yeah, so there's that. Here's another little experiment. I wish the audio was on now, but basically, can you turn it on?
Yeah.
Sweet.
It's,
This was me kind of thinking about how, too loud. Okay, I was thinking about procedural motion, how you think about character motion differently in a procedural setting versus an animation setting. So like, in an animation setting, you have a character animator that creates all these points on a graph editor. Instead, I wanted just them to just be birds. So in this case, there's a noise that's being passed through, and every time it hits a certain threshold, it will trigger them to generate a random rotation number, and that will rotate their head a certain amount. The other thing I think is really cool about this is that it's generating sound along with the movement, and so the two would kind of be linked together in a way that they wouldn't be linked together if you had a sound designer that was interpreting an animation piece. This was actually inspired by a paper that I saw. It was a really interesting thing where they had an object, and the object was made of aluminum in this simulation, and they were generating the sound waves based on a physical simulation of how aluminum would behave. So in this case, they had a like a tuning fork, and they dropped it, and the exact way that tuning fork fell is the sound that was generated. I think I did a poor job of explaining that, but you get the idea. I think it's a really interesting idea. So yeah, you can see this is the note graph. This is the noise being generated, it hitting certain thresholds, and then that rotation being applied to the geometry, essentially. Okay, so I thought, what if you could take this idea a bit farther, and what would be the next step? And so I made this character. It's just a character that operates under the same principles. You have a noise. Once it hits a certain threshold, it generates a random rotation, which is applied to, in this case, stand-in geometry for the face. And I love this idea because I thought, like, instead of actually having keyframes and having a character artist animate something, you could instead have kind of controls for mental states, or for for neurochemicals even. You could have an anxiety slider, and you could have a character and you'd slowly turn up the anxiety, and you'd see their face change. And I thought that'd be and you could kind of live perform a character animation. So this is just showing the node graph. And you can see I'm organizing all the geometry in a way that resembles the face, so that it's understandable to me. And actually, I do have a plan for this, since I'm going to update all the geometry and make it actually aesthetically pleasing. But I also plan to essentially use this character as use it in a VR environment and parent it to the head of my HTC Vive, and then also give myself hands so that I can actually become the character and act out scenes, which is actually not. There are a lot of people that have this idea right now. There's something called Mind. Does anyone know that VR acting program? Okay, I don't know. Yeah, but essentially becoming the character and being able to perform instead of actually doing the keyframes and everything. And yeah, of course, because there's VR and Touch Designer, I could just drop myself into the scene with this guy. And it's actually quite creepy when you're in the room with this guy and he's looking around and everything. Okay, what else? Okay, so this is the next. This is the last film I made, and this was actually made completely in real time. So I spent about 3 weeks. It was a very short turnaround, but I essentially wanted to perform a music video, and I wanted to be able to set everything up and then just hit record once while listening to the music and act something out, and then at the end just hit record and have it be done. So at the end it was one take, and the whole thing took 3 weeks to set up, but it was only a 5-minute performance. And is the audio still on?
Yeah.
I think so. Okay, so here's a clip from that. And all the horizontal lines are all being generated from the waveform of the music, by the way.
The top right is audio controls there.
What? That can't be all. idea. And that whole thing was recorded. It kind of has that aesthetic. You can kind of tell that it's a POV. It's a POV camera, and it's me just kind of walking around my studio. And I have a button for triggering, like starting the music and recording. I have a button for triggering particles to emit. I've got a control for how bright the lights are on the objects around me. So the process was actually really satisfying. I had my headphones on, my Vive headset on, and I just completely get lost in the music, and I just kind of try to act through it. And at the end, there's an uncompressed animation MOV on my desktop, and that becomes the final piece. So yeah, that was my first full real time, and like after making that, I'm just convinced that I'm really looking forward to making the next film. And I think at this point, this was a camera that was, the final render camera is actually from my POV, but I think in the future what I'd like is to also have the camera person be another actor in the VR space. So if you can imagine having a Vive headset on and you have two controllers, having that other person has the controller and they're across the room and they're using that to act as a virtual cinematographer, and they're zooming in on you and being able to kind of track your motion and everything like that. Okay, so this is now the future project section of this. Basically, I've been doing lots of VR sculpting using something called Masterpiece VR, and it's really interesting because you can kind of create these really densely detailed things, and they're kind of expressive, and the meshes that comes out of this VR sculpting program are actually very interesting and very nice. And so I really want to experiment with that next, and I'll be kind of that's a naked man. And I'll be kind of experimenting with using these kind of gestural 3D forms in combination with the procedural animation to make something that hopefully is really unusual and feels like it has a life of its own. Just a few sculpts, more nude men, and then this is the same models but taken into Maya, rendered with Arnold with subsurface scattering. And I don't know, I think that there's something so interesting about these forms because they feel alien and they feel really natural. And yeah, really excited to see what's going to come out of that. Yeah, so that's what I hope that my project folders will look like in the future. No EXRs, no sequences, no MOVs, just a single file. It's 34 KB, and you click on it, and then the thing opens up, and then it runs forever. And yeah, thank you. Any questions? All right. Oh, hey.
So, the real-time one that you just showed us.
Yeah.
What was that called?
It was for an artist. It's actually the same guy, Michael Red.
So he did the music, and then you did the.
Exactly. It's his ambient project. Yeah, he gave me the music, and then I worked directly for him.
So like you spent the 3 weeks preparing.
Mm-hmm.
Was that all just like how much of that time did you spend like practicing and playing in the space?
None of it.
So you built it all up and then kind of did the first exploration you captured?
Right, actually, yeah, that's right. So it was not a lot. I mean, I would test things out, of course. Like I have the line that's being drawn from my controller, and I would test that out. But the final performance, I kind of knew. I knew that I wanted like a kind of a cave scene. I knew all this kind of stuff, but I didn't. I would say that the last week, the narrative started to develop in my head, but the performances were really captured in the last 24 hours. And in fact, what was interesting about what I just showed you is that I ended up. You think you're saving time because it's just you're recording a performance, but I ended up taking 10 takes of it and choosing my favorite one. And each one I would like for different reasons. It's like, oh, the energy at this particular point would be really on, but the next part would be kind of boring or whatever. And I ended up, after doing 10 takes, I ended up using the second one, actually, not the first, but the second one. And even though it was, I had some CPU issue and the frame rate was lower and all these different things, there was something that was really essential about that single performance, and I ended up choosing that. Yeah.
Sorry, just a little follow-up to that one.
Yeah.
In that space, like how much of that is like real-time generated versus like how much did you model it?
So it's absolutely possible to generate meshes in real time, and there's lots of people who are doing it. In this particular case, I used a lot of the kind of iterative modeling techniques that I was mentioning before, where you extrude, maybe extrude, then you tessellate, extrude, tessellate, whatever. In this case, it was a combination of that. The cave forms were made in that way. And then it was also a combination of more Creative Commons models that were imported. And so yeah, I kind of made a combination of those two. The line, of course, was made in real time. The lighting effects were made in real time. The camera moves, the particles were all emitted in real time. But yeah, I think that having meshes generated in real time would be really interesting. But it's also pretty CPU intensive.
Right.
Yeah.
Like for the real-time recording you were doing it as the designer, and I'm wondering if you see a lot of like setting it up so that anybody can record their own version of the music video using the like that. So
yeah, what's interesting is that question actually came up last time a little bit. I see VR as not being ideal for that because it requires like a really fancy computer, and it requires, it's like $3,500 just to even get started with it. Though it's obviously going to get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and that kind of stuff. But my answer last time was there are already people who are thinking about the way that people can make their own music videos for music. There's this app called, I've forgotten already. I'll have to tell you afterwards. But it's essentially it's an MMO space for music performances. And so it's kind of like a 24-hour Burning Man type thing. And it's really just like that. It's because, they have musicians come into this online VR space and do a performance, and then people can attend that virtual performance. So they have Skrillex, and Skrillex is doing a VR set. And everyone's showing up to that specific location in the online world, and they're experiencing the music live. And the reason I mention it's like Burning Man is because there's also this weird drug system in it, where it's like you acquire points, you can buy these like VR drugs. You're not allowed to take the VR drugs yourself, you can only give them to other people. And then once you give them to other people, they start messing with your vision. So like sometimes it's like they'll add feedback to what you're seeing. They're really, really compelling, and and sometimes just, I've never done drugs before, but they're really, yeah, so I think it's absolutely a possibility with real time that's not possible with pre-rendered stuff, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see what people do with that in the future.
And then the other possibility that came to mind was, what about like doing real-time visuals for musicians that are also improvising?
Yeah, that'd be the ultimate, and like actually passing signal, because they're using they're using MIDI devices as well. If they were able to pass, I feel like you've done this before, haven't you? Yeah. Okay, Tim's done it. So passing MIDI information across a network, and then having that interact with visual stuff. Yeah, it'd be really cool. I haven't done it yet, but maybe I'll get some notes from you. I don't know. Cool. Anything else? Any other questions?
In terms of tooling, there seems to be like a big divide between kind of pre-rendered stuff and real-time stuff. Do you have any techniques to kind of going back and forth between like Touch Designer and Maya, for instance?
Oh, that's interesting. I think the workflow to get things from Maya into Touch Designer is really what you'd expect. You're exporting FBXs and OBJs and textures and everything. One thing that I see coming up that I didn't speak about, but it's definitely going to be a thing, is people are aware of Siphon being. Do you guys know what Siphon is? It's passing real-time video between. I have a feeling that all these programs are going to be eventually connected via Siphon. I have a feeling that Maya Viewport's eventually going to be a real-time engine. I don't know when, but that'd be. I just feel like everything's going that direction. So I think that eventually there will be real-time passing of information between things, maybe using Siphon, maybe using something else. One thing I do love about Touch Designer is that it does do that thing that you mentioned. You can kind of layer video and layer input. I could take the render of what my VR headset is seeing, and I can make that into a texture, and then make that texture into a normal map, and then apply that to a piece of 3D geometry, and then light that, and then render that again, and then that could be in the scene as well. So there's this weird kind of, everything is kind of folding in on itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah, Yeah.
Where do you see real time going in the next like 2 years?
What do I see real time like in
Like
general?
in terms of as a filmmaking tool.
Oh man, there's a lot of people out making. I don't know. I'm definitely not I'm not a futurist. I see a little bit of. I think I have some predictions that will come. I can't think of any off the top of my head. One person that, if you guys are interested in kind of VR or real-time filmmaking stuff, there's a guy named Kyle Natali who does real-time filmmaking in Unity, and it's becoming more and more common, just like Neil Blomkamp. But I think he would have a really, really interesting answer to that question. Well, here's one thing: is as you may know, Octane is being integrated into Unity, so we're gonna have, or we do already have, real-time ambient occlusion and final gather light bouncing calculations being done on the GPU. So that's going to be interesting. Touch Designer doesn't have anything like that, but that is in Unity right now. But I can't think of any other predictions off the top of my head. Maybe I'll think about it for a couple minutes and then talk to you.
Do you have any thoughts on high dynamic range as like a new format for display?
I've seen a couple of phones coming out with HDR capabilities. I'm not sure. I don't have an opinion on that necessarily. I don't know. I don't think I've even seen a 10-bit display. Have you?
Yeah. So I actually bought a Sony X900E, like a 55-inch TV, and it is HDR compatible.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you guys have heard of the new the Netflix movie that came out with Will Smith.
What was that called?
Yeah.
It's like the weird blue guy that's a cop.
It was weird that actually I didn't mind it. Like for what it was, I thought it was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
It's like Lord of the Rings meets Training Day. It's very exciting. But plot aside, it's high dynamic range, and most of it takes place over one night. And so you're actually seeing these two cops driving like in a dark alleyway, but then you see like street lamps behind them, and everything has this really realistic bloom. Like the brightness is insanely realistic, like how our eyes adapt to different exposures.
Yeah.
And so my feeling is that rather than continually thinking about resolution, like 4K, 8K, like that's going to probably happen. But what's exciting is seeing more real brightness values map.
That's really interesting.
Displays, right?
Yeah.
So that could be potential.
Yeah, it's interesting. There is a kind of obsession with resolution, higher and higher resolution. But yeah, that's another dimension to it.
But like,
that's
have you
interesting.
ever
I'll have to see
been
that.
to a planetarium and you notice like it's still quite dim? Like you see the stars in the planetarium.
Like the Space Center, the H.R. McMillan Space Center?
Yeah.
Yeah. Not HDR.
Give it the times.
Give it the times. Like 8-bit is so 2017. I think it's 10-bit now. Cool. Excellent. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much.
What's that? One more. Sorry, that was the same presentation
It
as
seems
the
like
last time.
everything, all the textures were all real time. It's all rendered real time. The only thing that's like really static are these modeled objects.
Yeah, totally agree.
And like I'm not the technician to know what is the technical reason why